With great pleasure, joining us as U.S. Treasury Secretary, Mr. Scott Bessent. Treasury Secretary, thank you very much. Can you fix this? Can you and E.J. Antoni, can you get E.J. in there to fix the Bureau of Labor Statistics before any more damage is done?
Well, Larry, good to be with you. And it's a real problem. As you said, if the Fed says they're data dependent and the data has been atrocious, then it seems like there's probably some makeup cuts in order here, or the size of this month's cut needs to be recalibrated. And sure, it could be fixed. Anything can be fixed. You just have to first, we had to establish that it was broken, which President Trump did. Now we have to go about fixing it. And it wasn't working well before, that kind of this lazy notion that they had dropped down to these low response rates, 30, 40% response rates, and they intuited the balance. Intuiting the balance is going from quantitative to qualitative. We need good empirical data, and it's not easy to get to, but you got to want to get there, and we want to get there. I think EJ is a great person to do it. I've known him for years. He's high integrity, data-driven, the ruthless truth pursuer.
Secretary, you mentioned recalibrate this month's meeting. It's an interesting point. Maybe they should go a half a point. And a lot of people think, very distinguished people think, that we ought to be at 3% Fed funds rate by the end of the year. We're at 4.5% now. Seems to me they're going to have to make some larger moves, in light of these numbers. But also, you've got market conditions, as I said. Dr. Copper's gone nowhere. Lumber prices are coming down. The curve is still inverted, things of that sort. Maybe the Fed will recalibrate. Maybe they should.
Well, they should. Let's see if they will. As John Maynard Keynes famously said, "Sir, when the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do?" And it turns out that we didn't have good facts.
Yes, right, absolutely. So let me ask you about Fed membership. First of all, Steve Myron, CEA chair, taking a leave of absence, going to the Fed. Do you think the Republican Senate can get him at the FOMC meeting in 10 days? Is there enough time?
I do. I think he could be voted on as soon as the 10th. So.
All right, as soon as the 10th. Now, second one, maybe a tougher nut to crack. President Trump has fired Lisa Cook. He has fired her. For allegations of mortgage fraud, primary residence, and so forth. But for him, he's the executive. He's the commander-in-chief. It's he who determines cause. He has fired her. What happens here? Will the administration nominate somebody to take her place? Or is there a way to keep her from being in the next FOMC meeting that we just talked about? After all, if she's fired, she shouldn't be voting on monetary policy, which she couldn't figure out on her own mortgage application. What happens to Lisa Cook?
Well, Larry, first of all, Dr. Cook hasn't said she didn't do it. She hasn't said she didn't do it. She keeps talking process, not facts. So what we've seen is that she's saying, she and her attorney have gone to court and said that President Trump doesn't have the right to fire her for cause, and clearly there is cause here. And as with so many of President Trump's policies, we've seen these activist courts get in the way. They slow down the process, but eventually, if this has to go on an expedited basis to the Supreme Court, President Trump is winning victory after victory. That the Democrats at large, the establishment in general, have decided that the only way to stop President Trump is through the courts, through these regional courts, and that's proving very unsatisfactory because eventually they get overruled.
Well, what's interesting here, Scott, is that the Fed, look, the Supreme Court just stayed a lower court and has now kept a Federal Trade Commission commissioner out. I mean, that person is essentially no longer an FTC commissioner. So I just wonder, that may be applicable. The Supreme Court took that move. Maybe that's going to be applicable to the Lisa Cook situation. I mean, if the president fires her, she should get her stuff out of the building. She's gone. And no FOMC meeting for her.
Well, Again, Larry, I've also been disappointed, and I've encouraged Chair Powell to do an internal investigation. We saw several governors leave for trading violations in the past few years, and the Fed did a very fulsome investigation of that. I am not sure why they're not doing an internal investigation here.
Secretary, you wrote, let's see, it came out last weekend, your latest op-ed piece in the Wall Street Journal, and you basically called now for a top-to-bottom review of all of Federal Reserve operations, monetary policy, regulatory policy, staffing, regional reserve banks, and the like. Tell us about that, because this sounds like a blueprint for a new Trump-oriented Federal Reserve Board.
It's not a blueprint for a new Trump-oriented Federal Reserve Board, Larry. It is a blueprint for a Fed that values its independence and monetary policy. Because of this gain of function, monetary policy and mission creep and bloat that the Fed has had, they are risking their monetary policy. That, I believe that the Fed should be able to set monetary policy on an independent basis, but the more creep we see within their mission, then the more it threatens their independence. And look, they covered themselves in glory in this decade. We had the worst inflation of 40 or 50 years. We never saw a post-examination of why things went wrong, how we could keep it from happening again. Regulatory policies, we saw the Silicon Valley Bank and the other two banks that went under, we saw that get swept under the rug. And the independence of the Fed exists because they have a special relationship with the American public. They get to be appointed without budget constraints because the American people believe that they are above reproach. And again and again, drifting away from the central mission has just caused so many problems. That editorial is part of a much longer 15-page piece in a magazine online called The International Economy, and I'd urge everyone to go and read that. Because the other thing that this Fed has done through these massive QE interventions and balance sheet growth is they've caused these wide disparities across different groups in the economies. That if you had assets, you've done great. If you didn't have assets, you've gotten crushed.
Interestingly, that's such an important point. A lot of people haven't benefited from that. We're seeing polling evidence and maybe some election evidence that the youth vote that Mr. Trump carried so well. Nonetheless, the Gen Zers are moving away from the Republican Party because of an affordability problem. I mean, in a way, the jobs that disappeared, and I think there's a 10.5% unemployment rate for youth. That's a problem. That's a Gen Z problem. It may be a larger problem. So it's time for the Fed to do what, Mr. Secretary? That's really the big question. If you're going to replace the Fed's management, and Jay Powell's going to be gone next spring, what do they replace it with?
They replace it with an open mind and a willingness to look at what's going wrong. What went wrong with the great inflation? What are we doing wrong? Why do we, their standard GDP estimate is 1.8%, and the forecast error has been 0.6, 0.7. Larry, you and I were both in the private sector in the economic modeling business, and you'd be fired for errors. If you had 30, 40% errors. And again, the other thing too is, why is it that the errors occur on the upside during Democrat administrations and on the downside during Republican administrations?
Yeah. That's a very good question. Two more quick ones. I know you're a busy chap. Number one, how about my King Dollar? I didn't see any mention of King Dollar in your op-ed piece. I know you didn't forget it. You must be saving it for something, Mr. Secretary.
Well, Larry, I have a very busy day, and with President Trump, most of the night job. and no one knows better than you after the first term. But I plan on getting something about the dollar, U.S. dollar dominance, and how we're going to keep that out in the coming quarters.
Yes. All right. Well, listen, a great country needs a great currency. Last one is this business about IEEPA, which is now being held up in the courts. Worst case, you might have to refund $400 billion worth of tariffs. I don't know how the heck you do that in any orderly fashion. And after all, isn't trade policy part and parcel of foreign policy? And foreign policy is left up to the president. He is the commander in chief. I don't see how these lower courts can prevent the president from using IEEPA, international economic emergency. He needs urgency and speed to rebalance the federal trading, the world trading system, which has been broken for years. What are you thinking about IEEPA? And if the Supreme Court goes against you, do you have a fallback for IEEPA?
Larry, I'm confident the Supreme Court's going to go with us, and let's divide the tariffs into two categories that the president has used his emergency powers on. One is the fentanyl tariffs. And if this fentanyl epidemic in the U.S. that's costing 200,000, causing 200,000 deaths a year, and then ruining people's lives, several hundred thousand on top of that, and that's coming across the borders, then I don't know what the president has authority to use if it's not for this fentanyl emergency. The second is with the reciprocal tariffs to bring down these massive trade deficits. As you and I know, in economics and markets, there's something called a tipping point, and my judgment, that as someone who's taught economic history, is that we were very close to the tipping point, and the emergency nature of it is we're close to the waterfall, and President Trump has taken us away from the edge. We're going back upstream to a safer place. We're going to move into balance. We've secured incredible trade deals for the American people to bring back manufacturing. And Larry, what's going unnoticed in these trade deals too is the other side. We put on 15, 20, 25% tariffs, and we're collecting substantial revenue. But the other way to get to balance is to make the other countries take down their tariffs on us, non-tariff barriers, subsidies, and U.S. companies are benefiting from that on their exports. I would expect to see a big increase in export due to the other side of the equation, which nobody talks about. And yes, we do have a fallback position. It's more cumbersome, and I think it limits the president's hands to do these great deals. We've got the Chinese who are willing to put in $550 billion in direct investment into the U.S. Koreans, a very large amount. And these trade deals are astounding. They're bringing in trillions and trillions of dollars. And what a shame, what a tragedy it would be to be overruled on this. But this is the president's signature policy. First he solved the border, now he's solving trade. And I think courts are very reluctant to overrule a president's signature policy.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And as I said, trade policy is part and parcel of foreign policy. Foreign policy is the domain of the commander-in-chief. Supreme Court shouldn't get in the way of that either. Anyway, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, thanks very much for your time. Good luck.
Good, Larry. Good to see you.